My name is Eric Gaskell, and you're listening to the Distorted History Podcast.
To speak the truth, the whole truth, frankly and boldly.
I can give you merry tales and joyous laughter.
Shameless, unreasoning, unjustified terror.
A long struggle for freedom.
It really is a revolution.
Come the turn of the century, it seems that both Butch Cassidy and Sundance were increasingly of the opinion that their time in the American West as outlaws was nearing its end. Sure, they had just pulled off a pair of back-to-back large scores when they robbed a train near Tipton, Wyoming of some $55,000, which they then are believed to have followed up within a few weeks' time by hitting a bank in Winnemucca, Nevada, and making off with some $30,000. Those jobs, however, feel more like a last gasp of their brand of outlawry. The pair and their gang then were very much hunted men by all the forces who they had stolen that money from, forces that Butch and Sundance inadvertently aided when they and several of their friends and fellow outlaw gang members, while gathering in Fort Worth, Texas for Will Newscarver's wedding, popped into a local photographer's studio to have their picture taken in their fine clothes, a picture that would ultimately end up in the hands of the authorities, thus providing them with the clearest image they had ever obtained of several of those very much wanted individuals. An image that could then be used to print up highly accurate wanted posters for these men, thereby making it far easier for them to be identified wherever they went. The hunt then was very much on for Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and the various members of their gang, the Wild Bunch. Yet before I get into that hunt and the various other factors making the life of an outlaw in the American West exceedingly dangerous at the turn of the century, first, like always, I want to acknowledge my sources for this series, which include Tom Hatch's The Last Outlaws, The Lies and Legends of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, Paul Kuistra's Criminals as Heroes, Structure, Power, and Identity, Richard Patterson's Butch Cassidy, A Biography, Donna B. Erdt's The Sundance Kid, The Life of Harry Alonzo Longabaugh, and Charles Kelly's The Outlaw Trail, A History of Butch Cassidy and His Wild Bunch. And like always, these and any additional sources like websites that I used will be listed on this podcast Twitter and Ko-fi pages, links to which are in the description. And with all that being said, let's begin. Now, how much of Butch and Sundance's desire to get out of the outlaw life was related to that Fort Worth photograph is unclear, as they may not have even realized at the time how exposed they were due to having that picture taken. They simply may not have known that the photographer had made an extra copy and hung it in the window of his shop, a copy that was then seen by some individual who recognized at least one of the outlaws in it, and upon figuring that the other men were likely outlaws as well, passed it on to the various authorities and private detectives looking to hunt them down. Yet, even if they did not know any that had transpired, it had seemingly been apparent to Cassidy for a while at that point that the law was getting too close for comfort. Even without the photograph, they had really just become too well known. Specifically, the authorities were increasingly aware of and familiar with their tactics and the ways they committed robberies. Butch then seemed to have the sense that it was only a matter of time before all the members of the Wild Bunch were killed and or captured. Indeed, despite their own recent successes, Cassidy's Wild Bunch were increasingly alone in managing to pull off such robberies, as many other attempts made by other criminals lately were more often than not ending in failure. This was due to a multitude of reasons. For one, the railroads and express companies were growing increasingly sophisticated in building new cars that were designed specifically to prevent men like them from getting in regardless of dynamite. Additionally, these companies were also setting up a system to encourage their crews to resist robbers. The days of trusting that train crews would wisely put their own safety first and cooperate with outlaws like Butch and Sundance were going away, as basically now companies were tying promotions, raises, and plum assignments to crews that had a good record. Importantly, anything that went wrong, be it a simple delay to having their train robbed, would then act as a black mark on said record. Such a mark then would prevent further advancement in the company, which is all to say that train crews were now being incentivized to resist and not do as ordered by the bandits, which was a concern for men like Butch and Sundance in particular, as they, from all accounts, had made it this far into their criminal careers without killing anyone. These changes, though, were seemingly making violence more likely than ever to happen. Meanwhile, the Federal Commissioner of Railroads round about the same time had issued a list of recommendations to combat the kind of train robberies that the Wild Bunch were known to commit. Among these recommendations was a suggestion that railroads and express companies should start employing extra guards when transporting valuable cargo, which was bad news for outlaws like the Wild Bunch in and of itself. What was worse, though, was the recommendation that these guards should be armed with cutting-edge repeating shotguns and should also be trained to shoot first and ask questions later. The increasing potential of violence and death involved in such crimes didn't just end there either, as there were also rumors of additional measures being discussed for ways to counter and even eliminate bandits like the Wild Bunch. Measures like installing on trains things like searchlights, Gatling guns, revolving turrets, or even electrified steel plates in the floor of the express cars that could then be used to electrocute any bandit unfortunate enough to step on one. There were even rumors of talk of ways to route pipes that could be used to spray would-be robbers with either burning oil or steam from a boiler. It wasn't just the railroads either, as banks were also ramping up their own security around this time, as they started having armed guards on site at all times. Then there was E.H. Harriman, the man effectively in charge of the Union Pacific Railroad. To understand Harriman and the threat he presented, you have to remember that this was the Gilded Age, a time where a select few were extremely wealthy and were unashamed of flaunting said wealth. Wealth that also gave the select few ultra-wealthy undue influence over the country and its politicians, a completely unimaginable situation not at all like today. As such, the Gilded Age was a time marked by extreme political corruption. The Grant administration alone was involved in such scandals as the gold conspiracy, the credit mobilier scandal, the salary grab, and the whiskey ring. Meanwhile, even as the ultra-wealthy were flaunting their vast riches and engaging in political corruption, many in the country were poor and suffering, as illustrated by the fact that 11 million of the 12 million families in the U.S. earn less than $1,200 a year, with the average income among those 11 million families being just $380, an amount that, to be clear, was well below the poverty line. The ultra-wealthy individuals who stood at the top of this corrupt pyramid then came to be known as robber barons. Mark Twain, who had coined the term the Gilded Age to describe this era of extreme wealth and the corruption that lay underneath, would also describe these individuals and their motivations as he wrote, quote, "What is the chief end of man? To get rich. In what way? Dishonestly if we can, honestly if we must." Which brings us back to the aforementioned E.H. Harriman. Even though he's somewhat forgotten now compared to others like Andrew Carnegie, Cornelius Vanderbilt, John D. Rockefeller, and J.P. Morgan, Harriman was at the time as well known of a figure as any of them. Harriman had started at age 14 by taking after his grandfather and working on Wall Street. He then started building the foundation for his future success by investing in the railroad industry as it was just getting started. Even his marriage seemed to serve this end, as he married the daughter of a banker who also owned a railroad in New York. That being said, Harriman focused primarily on the world of finance until he purchased a small bankrupt railroad. The future robber baron then quickly reorganized the railroad and sold it to a larger one for a sizable profit. Seeing then the potential for enormous wealth, Harriman positioned himself to become the director of the Illinois Central Railroad and eventually its vice president. E.H. Harriman was likely comfortably wealthy at this point, but he wouldn't really move into the big leagues until he purchased control of the Union Pacific Railroad in 1897. From there, he just kept getting richer and richer. Indeed, by the time of his death, Harriman controlled the Wells Fargo Express Company, the Pacific Mail Steamship Company, and 5 railroads, including both the Union and Southern Pacific, all of which meant his net worth was estimated to have been somewhere between $700 and $100 million, which equates to something like $2.3 to $3.3 billion today. As such, Harriman and his railroads were able to wield enormous influence, which was true in general, but especially true in California, where his Southern Pacific or SP was crucial to California's economy. Thus, they had quite a bit of power when it came to influencing the state's legislature, something that many seemed to be aware of. Harriman was then villainized in the works of writers like Frank Norris, Ambrose Bierce, and Jack London. He also became a real-world villain in the eyes of many as a result of the Mussel's Flow massacre. Everything started when the Southern Pacific Railroad didn't know what to do with all the land they owned in the area that was at the time known as the Mussel's Flow District. So, having nothing else to really do with said land, the railroad invited farmers to move onto it, with the promise that they would eventually have the opportunity to buy the land they were living on at a rate of $2.50 an acre. In all, it seemed like a fair deal, so a number of people took them up on said offer and began building their lives there. These individuals and families built homes and barns, they dug irrigation ditches and even set up roads, turning what had been empty, unused land into a farming community. Yet, when the railroad decided it was time to sell the land, they offered it to the settlers not for the $2.50 an acre they had promised, but for $25 an acre, or, exactly 10 times the amount they had told the farmers they would be expected to pay. This was obviously outrageous, and so the farmers refused to meet the railroad's demands. The Southern Pacific, however, would not budge, as they felt they held all the cards. The way they saw it, it was still their land, so the farmers could either meet their demands, or they could leave and thus abandon everything they had built. The farmers naturally resisted and formed the Settlers' Land League, which asked for the public support and a federal investigation. The Southern Pacific, however, didn't care about their complaints or their little league, or even the threat of an investigation. So on Monday the 11th of May 1880, the railroad dispatched Deputy U.S. Marshal Alonzo W. Poole and one of their employees, William Clark, with eviction papers in hand. These men, along with another pair of individuals who had supposedly agreed to purchase some of the occupied land from the railroad, headed out to one of the farms. When they arrived, however, this quartet was met by a dozen or so members of the League who were intent on preventing this eviction. One thing then led to another, exactly what no one seems to know, but eventually a gunfight erupted, leaving 7 men dead, 2 of the men representing the railroad's interest, and 5 members of the League, for which another 5 members of the League would be arrested, charged, found guilty, and jailed for 8 months for quote-unquote obstructing the eviction process. This incident only served to fuel anti-railroad sentiments, the kind of sentiments that made the outlaws who robbed them seem almost heroic by comparison. For example, in addition to the likes of Cassidy's Wild Bunch, there was also the Sontag and Evans gang, a gang led by George Sontag and Chris Evans, 2 men who had grievances with the Southern Pacific and so had decided to start robbing it. Evans in particular would eventually write a novel in which he envisioned a more perfect republic where socialists and not robber barons like Harriman led the country. That would not happen though, as instead Harriman and the other robber barons would only increase their wealth and influence. Now, Harriman is important to our story because he was the one who really pushed for his Union Pacific trains to have quote-unquote posse cars, a concept explicitly designed to counter the tactics of outlaws like the Wild Bunch. These posse cars you see were special train cars that were placed at strategic locations along the rail lines. These cars, as soon as word came in that a robbery had taken place, would be loaded with men and horses. Once loaded, these cars would then be taken by an especially fast locomotive to the site of the robbery, thereby enabling pursuit of the outlaws far quicker than had ever been possible in the past. Additionally, these posses were also designed to be far superior than what might normally be rounded up at a moment's notice in response to a robbery, as instead of inexperienced townfolk and some random horses that may or may not be fit for a prolonged chase, Harriman insisted on experienced men and high-quality horses. On top of that particular complication, the Union Pacific under Harriman's leadership was also making sure that the rewards for the men who would rob them were specified as being good dead or alive, something that the other railroads had historically shied away from doing, as, after all, it was a business tacitly asking for men to be murdered for allegedly committing a crime. As remember, these bounties were being put out on individuals who had in no way been convicted. They were just people suspected of committing the crime, which was seen as potentially not so great a look for a railroad and one that might further turn the public against him. The Union Pacific under Harriman's leadership, however, had apparently decided to not worry about such bad optics. Indeed, in some cases, they even offered higher rewards for dead outlaws. That all being said, in the movie Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid, it's depicted as if Harriman was targeting the aforementioned pair of outlaws specifically, which does not seem to have been the case. Instead, this was all in response to train robberies in general, which of course included the Wild Bunch, but this wasn't a campaign against them in particular. Nor was the UP alone in pursuing such tactics, as Wells Fargo too was offering bounties for the capture of the men who would rob their express cars, either dead or alive. Indeed, all members of the Wild Bunch had bounties of $10,000 each for their capture or murder. Then there was the issue of private detectives like the Pinkertons and even Wells Fargo's own detectives like Frank Dodge, who were being paid by these rich and powerful companies to hunt down outlaws like Cassidy and his Wild Bunch. This was another important development, as in contrast to small-town sheriffs with limited jurisdiction and posses of random inexperienced townfolk, these were professional forces whose reach was nationwide. Yet it wasn't just the experience and reach of these new forces either, it was also the new tools they had at their fingertips. As you see, it wasn't just individuals or even groups of individuals who were now working to capture the likes of the Wild Bunch, but an entire system. One of the key pieces of which being telegraphs and even telephones, whose lines were now linking disparate towns and communities together. Through these new, rapid forms of communication, descriptions of suspects and even the latest reports of their movements were spread far and wide. It was now becoming harder for outlaws to outrun their pursuit, as even if they were able to outrun one posse, word could still be passed on ahead faster than they could ride, so lawmen could be prepared and laying in wait for them. In addition to these new rapid forms of communication were improvements in printing that allowed for photographs to be replicated, which was important because wanted posters in the past might have consisted of physical descriptions of the wanted individual and/or hand-drawn approximations of what they looked like. A drawing that may have a detail wrong here or there, or may just be difficult to make an accurate identification with as you're comparing a drawing to an actual flesh and blood individual. Now, though, these posters could feature an actual photographic image of the person they were after. This obviously made identification far easier, and it also made the gang's decision to get their picture taken in Fort Worth all the worse in hindsight, as their pictures were now everywhere. It was likely then, as a result of any number of these factors, that Butch started having the feeling that the West was getting too small for him. Groups like the Wild Bunch had been able to take advantage of the still wild and untamed parts of the American West, but those areas were becoming fewer and fewer as civilization and everything that came with it was starting to close in. A changing world that is also reflected in the game Red Dead Redemption 2, whose Vanderlyn gang was likely inspired by Cassidy and his Wild Bunch. Indeed, the forces pursuing the outlaws in the game, most notably the Pinkertons, were also after Cassidy, explicitly at one point tell the outlaws that their time has passed. With the life of an outlaw looking like it was about to become increasingly hard and potentially very deadly for all involved, it seemed best for the likes of Butch and Sundance to call it quits and settle down to live a quiet, normal life. Something that they could potentially do thanks to their recent successful robberies and whatever money they had managed to save over the years. Indeed, it seems that between the two men, they had enough money to start their own ranch. The problem was, with the law and the Pinkertons after them, it wasn't like they could just comfortably settle down someplace in the West and remain unmolested. With their pictures being circulated all across the western reaches of the US, the pair were simply too well known there. The question then became, where could they go to settle down and live a quiet life without fear of the Pinkertons or some other law enforcement agents breaking down their door at any moment? They could potentially go east. The authorities and the Pinkertons probably wouldn't be looking for them there. However, everything was just so much more expensive in that part of the country. If they tried settling down in the east, their money just wouldn't go very far. Plus, they were men used to the wide open spaces of the West. They simply wouldn't be at home in the East. Anyway, what would they do there? They were cowboys, not tradesmen or factory workers. Canada was another potential option, but the reputation of their Mounties was legendary, so the chance of eluding such an acclaimed force for any length of time seemed slim. So with the American West being where they were leaving, and with going north or east out of the question, their only real option left was to head south. That being said, they apparently weren't real interested in going to Mexico. South America, however, was a different story. While sure the region was known for significant jungle/rainforest, environments that neither man had any experience with, it was also supposed to have areas of mountains and wide open prairies. In other words, lands not all that dissimilar to the kinds of places they knew and loved. South America, they believed, then potentially offered lands that were very much like the American West had been before it started being developed and closed in. Indeed, they may or may not have been aware of a recent series of articles published in National Geographic about just such a region, a territory in southern Argentina called Patagonia that lay between the Andes and the Atlantic. Patagonia offered Butch and Sundance the kind of wide-open plains they were used to and would be a great place to settle down and start a ranch, especially since Argentina was on the verge of experiencing an economic boom, a boom that was at least partially the result of England suffering an outbreak of hoof-and-mouth disease, an outbreak that meant England was going to have to start importing beef and mutton, a turn of events that Argentina's sheep and cattle industry was about to profit immensely off of. As the pair of outlaws were making their plans to become former outlaws, Sundance informed Cassidy of a slight alteration he was making. Namely, a woman who is known as either Etta or Ethel Place was coming with them. The Pinkertons would describe Etta as standing 5'4" and weighing about 110 pounds, with medium complexion and brown hair that was often worn in a roll on top of her head. They believed her to be around 27 years old and would state that she appeared to be a quote-unquote refined type. Other than this description, though, not a lot is known about Etta, other than she and Sundance seemed to be in some kind of serious relationship. Yet even the exact nature of this relationship is a bit mysterious, as even though the pair often presented themselves as husband and wife, it's still unclear if they had actually been formerly married or not, although that really doesn't matter. Now, Hollywood would present Etta as an innocent and pure schoolteacher, which may or may not have been true, as it's also been suggested that Etta was in fact a quote-unquote working girl from Fanny Porter's quote-unquote sporting house in San Antonio, meaning she was a sex worker. Fanny Porter's sporting house was a fairly famous locale sitting on the corner of Durango Street in San Antonio. This enterprise, which had been established by Fanny when she was just 20 years old after emigrating from England, had a reputation for offering the most beautiful women from 18 to 25, all of whom practiced proper hygiene. This sporting house then became a popular spot for both outlaws and lawmen. Anyone was welcome, even outlaws who would not be turned in. Indeed, the only exception to their welcoming policy was anyone who dared to abuse the women. As a result, the sporting house was frequented by everyone, from members of the Wild Bunch to the likes of William Pinkerton himself. That all being said, whether Etta actually worked there or not is unknown. Really, everything about her seems to be speculation. Indeed, even the idea of her being a sex worker seems to be based upon the report of one Pinkerton agent who stated, quote, "My impression is that he may have met her in a house of ill fame," before adding, quote, "I have no personal knowledge." As such, it's either pure speculation or at best second-hand information. Bringing this back to the idea that the story of Butch and Sundance heavily inspired the narrative and characters of Red Dead Redemption 2, you can arguably see both potential characterizations of Etta Place played out in the game, with Abigail Marston, John Marston's wife, a former sex worker who fell in love with and ran off with an outlaw, and Mary Linton, the innocent law-abiding woman who had fallen in love with and even for a time was engaged to marry outlaw Arthur Morgan. Regardless of her true background, it's generally believed that following the Wilcox train robbery, the one where they blew up the bridge and first encountered Charles E. Woodcock, after eluding the various posses on this trail, Sundance traveled down to Texas, where it's believed the pair first met. The two had been together for a bit at this point then, but still, according to Cassidy's sister, when he was informed of Sundance's intentions of bringing Etta with him to Argentina, he was against the idea. It was Cassidy's belief that where they were headed was no place for a woman. Sundance, however, would not take no for an answer, especially since Etta could apparently ride and shoot as well as any man. Whether it was out of respect for Etta's apparent skills or simply because he realized Sundance was not going to budge on this point, Cassidy eventually agreed that she could join them in setting up their ranch in Argentina. With their minds made up to leave, Butch and Sundance split up, intent on wrapping up whatever business they had to take care of before leaving America behind, with their plan being to meet up in New York City, from where they would depart on a ship headed for their new home. During this time, Etta and Sundance seem to have done some traveling around the U.S., doing so under the names Harry A. Place and Ethel Place, as Sundance claimed to be a cattle buyer from Wyoming. Along the way, the couple would visit New Orleans, where they celebrated the New Year together. They also made sure to stop off in Pennsylvania to visit his family, with Sundance introducing Etta to his sisters and brother as his wife. In doing so, though, the couple had to keep their visits secret and clandestine, as the Pinkertons had by this point identified Sundance as Harry Longabaugh and thus had his family under surveillance. During this period, Sundance and Etta visited Niagara Falls for what might have been a bit of a honeymoon trip, as it was a popular destination for such an occasion at that time. The pair would finally arrive in New York in February 1901, at which point they checked into the Best Suite in Mrs. Catherine Taylor's boarding house, where they would eventually be joined by Butch, who also rented a room there under the name of James Ryan, as he claimed to be Ethel's brother. The trio then spent 3 weeks enjoying life as tourists in the big city, one quite unlike anything they were used to, what with its skyscrapers, streetlights, and brand new automobiles that drove up and down its streets. It's believed the trio likely lived the high life during this time, visiting the city's numerous taverns and night spots, eating at 5-star restaurants, and taking in popular vaudeville shows or maybe even catching a performance on Broadway. At the very least, we know Sundance and his apparent wife Anna got their pictures taken of just the two of them in their fancy clothes in one of the best studios in the city, the D. Young Photography Studio on Broadway. It's also known that the trio visited Tiffany's, the famous jewelers, where they purchased multiple pieces. Cassidy, for example, got himself a gold watch, while Sundance got himself a diamond stick pin and a gold lapel watch for Etta. Now, while the trio were likely living it up in New York City enjoying themselves, the weather during this time was anything but pleasant. Indeed, their departure was likely delayed when on the 20th of February, huge blocks of ice made their way down the Hudson and East rivers, and in doing so trapped ships in New York's harbor until they melted. Once the weather finally abated though, Butch, Sundance, and Etta were free to leave, doing so without apparently catching the attention of the authorities, as in those days one could travel internationally without being required by law to show your passport. And so the pair of wanted outlaws and their lady friend boarded a British passenger/cargo steamer that was bound for Buenos Aires, Argentina, where they arrived on the 23rd of March 1901, at which point the three Americans settled into the finest and most fashionable hotel in the city, the Hotel Europa, while Sundance traveled down to the London River Plate Bank, also in the city, where he deposited $12,000. With that taken care of, it was time to start looking for the land that they needed to start their ranch. To help in this search, they reached out to one Dr. George Newberry, a dentist and more importantly, the vice consul for the U.S. in Buenos Aires. Newberry was apparently the right man to ask, as he knew of a perfect spot for raising livestock, an isolated stretch of land that sat near the Chilean border at the foot of the Andes Mountains, a valley known as Cholila. On the dentist/consul's recommendation, the trio traveled out to Cholila to see it with their own eyes, and in doing so found a territory of vast and plentiful grasslands and scattered lakes, land that was quite similar to western Montana, a territory that they were intimately familiar with. It was, in their estimation then, perfect land for raising cattle and other livestock. Plus, with its location near the Chilean border, it wouldn't be hard to drive the herds into Chile to sell them there for a nice profit while they waited for the European markets to be set up. Also of note, and especially appealing to the wannabe former outlaws, was how secluded and largely undeveloped the territory was, as it was 400 miles from the nearest railroad and telegraph wires had yet to be extended into the region. Factors that likely served to make the land cheap, as the most valuable land in Argentina at the time was either close to cities like Buenos Aires or located near a railroad. This land was neither. It was isolated and secluded, which also meant it was a perfect place to vanish and start over, far away from the Pinkertons and their ilk. Satisfied by what they had found, they then set about the process to purchase some land in Cholila, 25,000 acres to be precise, under the names of James Ryan and Harry A. Place. A process which apparently involved demonstrating their intentions of developing said land by having some 1,300 sheep, 400 heads of cattle, and 35 horses living there. Round about the same time as Butch and Sundance were setting up their new lives in Argentina, it seems that the Wild Bunch was pulling off one final job. On the 3rd of July 1901, the Great Northern Railroad's Express No. 3, the Coast Flyer, was brought to a stop by some bandits outside the town of Wagner in northern Montana. A target likely chosen because, unlike Harriman's Union Pacific, the Great Northern Railroad was not offering dead or alive bounties, and nor did they have a system of posse cars set up. Things got started as was typical of a Wild Bunch train robbery when one of the bandits, likely Harvey Logan, entered the locomotive's compartment and ordered the engineer to stop the train. When this was done, the outlaws again followed the familiar script, as they had the baggage and express cars separated from the passenger cars so they could be pulled a ways down the track, at which point they used dynamite to blow open the safe in the express car, gaining a supposed $40,000 in the process. However, this differed from your typical Wild Bunch job in one important aspect: it resulted in bloodshed and even death. The uncharacteristic trouble started when a pair of men from the train's crew started running down the track putting out warning flares so as to prevent a collision with another train. Seeing this, one of the robbers just started shooting, hitting both men, one of whom would later die of his wounds. They didn't stop there either, as not even the passengers in their cars were safe, as an 18-year-old girl would be shot in the shoulder when she leaned out the window to see what was happening. The outlaws didn't stop there either, as the bandits, for no apparent reason other than terrorizing the people inside, shot at the passenger car before running off. Now, none of the passengers would be hurt by this particular volley, but it was still an act distinctly out of character for the Wild Bunch, or at least the Wild Bunch under the leadership of Butch and Sundance. Which is why, despite some claiming that the pair had taken part in this particular robbery, I don't really buy it. Granted, I could be a victim of the general myth-making around the two men. The thing is, though, as far as I can tell, there really was no violence, and especially not this kind of indiscriminate violence, in any of the crimes typically attributed to the pair. So, while, spoiler, Butch and Sundance would ultimately die in a gunfight, they did so fighting with men who were either trying to kill or arrest them, not some random civilians who were of no threat. Plus, it just seems strange to me that the pair would leave Argentina, where they were trying to get their new life started, well away from the dangers of American lawmen and the Pinkertons, to travel all the way back to the US to take part in such a robbery, especially one that included such pointless, out-of-character violence. Which, to be clear, is not to say that neither man ever returned to the US, as Sundance and Etta returned to the country the following year to seek medical treatment for some sort of illness or injury that he was suffering from. The pair would ultimately spend 6 months in the States, during which time Sundance recovered from whatever he was suffering from. At which point, before heading back to Argentina, he visited his sister in Pennsylvania and his brother in Atlantic City, whose 7-year-old son would remember going to the beach and playing with his uncle in the sand. Now, notably, during this time, a train would be robbed near DuPont, Illinois, a crime that would be attributed to Butch and Sundance after some eyewitnesses were shown a photograph of the two outlaws, and they claimed that the men responsible resembled at least one of the men pictured. A robbery that again followed a similar script as the Wild Bunch's known escapades. Namely, the bandits boarded the train and made their way to the locomotive where they ordered the crew to stop the train. From there, they used the threat of dynamite to get into the express car, where they then used said dynamite to get into one of the safes, doing so before ultimately fleeing when the passengers started approaching to see what was going on. Again, like the last robbery though, I'm not really sold that this was them. Sure, there are some similarities in methods, in that they ordered the crew to bring the train to a stop, rather than employing other methods used to stop trains like placing obstacles or fires on the tracks. And they seem to be fairly intent on avoiding conflict with the passengers. That said, though, they did not order the passenger cars separated from the cars they were actually interested in, as had become typical Wild Bunch robberies, which is likely why the passengers were able to get close enough to unnerve the bandits, thus causing them to leave with the contents of only one of the safes, an estimated $500. As for the eyewitness identification that the bandits resembled Butch and or Sundance, eyewitness testimony is really unreliable. Plus, if Sundance was involved, he would have had to make excellent time to get back to New York from Illinois, as it's known he left the country with Etta a week after the robbery took place, something that is generally considered to have been extremely unlikely for him to achieve. The couple also reportedly visited the US again in 1904, stopping off in Fort Worth and perhaps even attending the World's Fair in St. Louis. They did not seem to have stayed long that time though, as by late February, Sundance was back in Argentina, as he purchased some bulls while Butch was laid up back at the ranch with a quote-unquote town disease that was probably an STD of some sort. During Sundance and Etta's visits back to the States, Cassidy was left by himself to work on the ranch, while likely spending his downtime reading, as he yet to really master Spanish to the point that he felt confident and capable of engaging with others. That being said, all three Americans, when they were at home on the ranch, would manage to endear themselves to the local community. Indeed, they seem to have actively attempted to make a good impression on their new neighbors, as they would be described as always displaying proper manners and having a pleasant disposition when they did things like attending local fiestas. Indeed, during one such gathering, they would meet and impress the territorial governor to the point that he stayed in their home that night. The Americans were also known to hand out candy to local children and even reportedly gave gold to some of the poor peasants living in the region, which is seemingly the closest the two men came to filling that Robin Hood-style role. The territorial governor stay in their home apparently wasn't unique either, as Cassidy, Sundance, and Etta reportedly regularly hosted guests in their four-room cabin that they had constructed and tastefully furnished. A structure that was built out of logs and thus stood out compared to the residences on neighboring ranches, which were typically constructed out of stone. Indeed, their cabin looked more like the type of structures typically found in the American West. As such, it was like a little piece of home in this foreign country. A home that all three might have lived in, although it's believed that Cassidy may have constructed his own little bachelor pad elsewhere on the ranch, thereby leaving the main cabin for Sundance and Etta. As for the people they entertained at their homes, sometimes they were just there for friendly visits, while other times they were there for dinner parties. For her part, Etta reportedly impressed in her duties as a hostess, as she was credited with being an excellent cook, especially when it came to Mexican cuisine. Many also seemed to find her both unique and captivating. For example, one visitor would note that Etta, quote, never wore dresses, just pants and boots, clothing that wasn't commonly seen on women in those days. Her bold fashion choices, though, seemed to fit her personality, as the same guest would describe her as, quote, free, forward, and very playful. Meanwhile, another visitor, a Welshman named Milton Roberts, would describe Etta as, quote, good-looking, a good rider, and an expert with a revolver, which seems to further support Sundance's assertion that she could look after herself. Guest also noted how she was always accompanied by her beloved Cocker Spaniel. As for Butch and Sundance, the local gauchos, loosely the Argentinian equivalent to the American cowboy, initially thought these Americans were too fancy to make good ranch hands. However, after the gauchos witnessed the two men conduct a cattle roundup early on during their residence, they came away impressed with their skills. Indeed, it seems that the pair were making a serious go of it as ranchers, as in addition to their home, they had also constructed all the appropriate outbuildings for such an operation, like a barn, a stable, a warehouse, and a chicken house. Indeed, they were reportedly even making a profit selling their livestock, doing well enough then that they actually hired a foreman and at least a pair of ranch hands to help assist in the work, men who they subsequently built a bunkhouse for them to live in. Between this and the degree to which they were from all accounts well liked and even respected by their neighbors, it seemed like Butch and Sundance had fully put their outlaw ways behind them and were ready to just live a quiet life on their ranch. Meaning that unlike the members of the Vanderlyn Gang in Red Dead Redemption 2 who also dreamed of fleeing the United States and settling down, Butch and Sundance actually seemed to have gotten away. Their quiet life on the ranch, however, would not save them from the Pinkertons, who remained determined to find and capture them. As it turns out, the Pinkertons were partially aided in this by the outlaws themselves, as they, with some regularity, kept in contact through letters to some of their old contacts in America, potentially doing so because they felt safe as they were no longer living as criminals and had actually settled down to live a quiet, respectable life in another country. It's possible then that since they were out of the game, they figured that nobody, not even the Pinkertons, would be all that interested in them anymore. Regardless of the motivation, it is known that Sundance in particular often wrote to his sister Samantha. Samantha and Sundance were very close, and indeed it said that she was like a mother to him, so it makes sense why they would stay in contact, which we know they did because the Pinkertons knew all about it, thanks to the help of a local postal employee in Montclair, Pennsylvania. As this postal employee not only spied on her home for the Pinkertons, but also intercepted her mail on their behalf. Mail which the Pinkertons then opened and read before resealing the envelopes and sending them back on their way. Through these communications, the Pinkertons learned the purported leaders of the Wild Bunch had fled down to Argentina. Knowing this in 1903, 2 years after the pair had departed the United States, veteran Pinkerton Frank DeMeo was dispatched down to Buenos Aires. Upon his arrival, DeMeo, just like the men he was hunting had done when they had first arrived, would pay a visit to Dr. George Newberry, who informed the Pinkerton that the three individuals he was asking after were currently ranching in the Cholula region. Yet, even though he had now located the pair, the Pinkerton agent did not immediately set off after them, as the doctor warned him that he would be risking his own life traveling during the rainy season, as the roads were especially treacherous at that time. In response to this news, the agency, at the direction of their president Robert Pinkerton, started making plans to trick Butch and Sundance into making the trip to Buenos Aires themselves, so they might be captured there and then return to the U.S. to be put on trial. Or at least that was their plan if they could find someone willing to pay for the expenses. After all, these were the Pinkertons. They weren't interested in quote-unquote justice as much as they were interested in getting paid a pretty penny for capturing the two highly elusive fugitives. The agency likely figured then that one of the railroads, banks, or express car companies that the Wild Bunch had made a habit of robbing would be interested in paying for the capture of the two men. However, apparently none of them seemed to have any interest in footing the bill, even though the cost of the expedition to capture the two outlaws would have been around $5,000, an amount that any one of these massive corporations or the American Bankers Association could have easily afforded, with their thinking possibly being the two were gone and most importantly had stopped robbing them, which was, after all, what they had wanted all along. So, while sure they might have liked their pound of flesh, it's not like their capture guaranteed a conviction. At which point in such a scenario, it was highly possible that the outlaws may launch a new campaign of theft against them. It was best then to just leave them alone. So, with no one willing to pony up the cash, Frank DeMeo, rather than pursuing the two wanted outlaws, instead returned home. Yet before doing so, he did make sure that wanted posters of Butch and Sundance were printed up and distributed to the various law enforcement officials and steamship companies in the region. Yet even with this, the pair were surely safe as long as they kept their heads down on their ranch. Which brings us to the events of February 1905 in the town of Rio Gallegos that sits on the southern tip of Argentina. And I'm going with that pronunciation, which may or may not be wrong, as I found 3 fairly distinct pronunciations online, but this is the one that says it's Argentinian. If it's wrong, I do apologize, but you're going to have to suffer with me for a bit. This time and place is important because a pair of American men arrived in town identifying themselves as Brady and Lyndon, men who may have been accompanied by a woman. One of these men stood roughly 5 feet 10 inches tall and had green eyes, blonde hair, and a light complexion, a description loosely matching Sundance's, while the other was shorter with dark brown or black hair, a beard, green eyes, and appeared to be sunburnt, a description that loosely matched Cassidy if he dyed his hair and beard. As the pair, potentially trio, checked into the Hotel Argentino, they claimed to be there representing a livestock company from Rio Negro that was looking for land to buy. Yet despite supposedly being their own business, it seemed that these Americans were mainly there just to eat fine foods and tip the waitstaff generously. They also came to be known by the locals around town as, quote, those crazy Yankees, because they had a habit of riding their horses at top speed whenever they came riding into town to buy supplies. Supplies like a surveyor's telescope and compass, which made sense if they were actually there looking to purchase some land. On the 14th of February, however, the pair or trio's real reason for being in Rio Gallegos became clear, as the 2 men who identified themselves as Brady and Lyndon walked into the town's bank just before it closed. Inside at the time were the bank manager and a cashier who were reportedly both absorbed in various paperwork. As such, they were especially surprised when the 2 men pulled out their long-barreled revolvers. With their intentions now clear, the Americans forced the bank manager to open the safe, from which they took some $100,000 worth of cash and silver in today's money. The bandits then stuffed their loot into some canvas bags before galloping out of town on their horses heading for the Gallegos River, behavior which notably many in town didn't think twice about, as that was how they always rode into and out of town. Local law enforcement in Rio Gallegos had no leads on who these American bandits might have been. However, the police chief in Buenos Aires, who had one of the Butch and Sundance wanted posters that had been distributed by the Pinkertons, upon hearing about the bank robbery instantly made the connection. A pair of known American bank robbers were living in their country, and a pair of Americans had just robbed a bank. Doing so not at night but in broad daylight, which was how the Wild Bunch had always committed their bank robberies. They never attempted to break in at night but instead entered during the day when the vault was unlocked and open. Even the descriptions of the outlaws loosely resembled Butch and Sundance. Indeed, they may have been accompanied by a woman, and the pair were known to be living with Etta. The thing was, while the general physical description could have lined up with Butch and Sundance, if Butch had dyed his hair and beard, the pair responsible for the Rio Gallegos bank robbery were consistently described as being 25 to 30 years old, at a time when Butch and Sundance were both around 40, a good decade-plus discrepancy. That being said, eyewitnesses aren't always reliable, and gauging someone's age by looks alone is not an exact science, so maybe it could have been them, if not for the fact that during the time when the bank was being robbed in Rio Gallegos, some 750 miles away in Cholula, all of Butch and Sundance's neighbors insist they were at home. Not only that, but the name Santiago Ryan, Butch's alias, appears on a purchase order at a store in the Cholula region from that same time. Plus, there was also a government agricultural census survey that took place in February 1905, whose records seemed to indicate that both men were at home in Cholula during that period. In other words, all the evidence seems to suggest that instead of robbing a bank in Rio Gallegos, Butch, Sundance, and Etta were all just continuing to live the quiet life as ranchers. Unfortunately, either the police chief in Buenos Aires was not aware of any of these facts or he just didn't really care. After all, it was easy to lay the blame for a bank robbery committed in Argentina by a pair of Americans at the feet of a pair of known American bank robbers residing in the country. Why waste time trying to investigate and hunt down a pair of criminals who had successfully gotten away, when you can easily say it was these other two men who you also knew where they were? As such, the police chief ordered the sheriff in charge of the region where Butch, Sundance, and Etta were living, one Eduardo Humphreys, to arrest the two men. The thing was, Sheriff Humphreys had actually become friends with the two American men, plus he was apparently quite besotted with Etta. So, rather than arrest the two men like he had been ordered, Eduardo instead warned his friends that they were now wanted by the Argentinian authorities. With this, through no apparent fault of their own, Butch and Sundance's attempt to go straight, their attempt to live a quiet life ranching, came to an abrupt and shocking end. All their hard work was about to be thrown out the proverbial window, as they now had to flee so they would not be arrested, meaning that Butch and Sundance were once again outlaws and wanted men. Things had taken a terrible turn for Butch and Sundance, who were now forced to flee the apparently successful ranch they had established in the Cholula region of Argentina. On top of being forced to give up the quiet lives they had established, they were also going to lose quite a bit of money, as they couldn't sell their land as it was technically homesteaded property, meaning they didn't actually own it. All they could do was sell the buildings they had built on it and the provisions they had stored there, all of which would be purchased by the manager of a Chilean land and cattle company for 18,000 pesos. As for their livestock, that would be sold at a later date by one of their neighbors who agreed to hold on to the money from the sale for them. As for all their other possessions like their dishes and furniture, that was split up among the various friends they had made in the region, their parting gift of sorts, as it was unlikely they would ever be able to see them again. So, with the news that their lives on the ranch were over, on the 9th of May 1905, Butch, Sundance, and Etta packed some cash and a few absolute necessities into some satchels and all boarded a steamer that was bound for Chile. The three then kind of disappeared from the historical record for a time, not popping up again until the end of the year. Where they were and what they did in the intervening time is unknown. Although on the 28th of June, Sundance would pen a letter to their now former neighbor Dan Gibbon, passing along some final instructions and saying goodbye, writing, quote, "We want you to take care of Davy and his wife and see that they don't suffer in any way, and be kind to the old spaniel and give him pieces of meat once in a while," with the spaniel in question likely being the one that accompanied Etta wherever she went. Sundance would then end his letter with, quote, "I don't want to see Cholula ever again, but I will think of you and all of our friends often, and we want to assure you of our good wishes." You get the feeling then that they had found a home there, and the sudden inexplicable loss of it was painful for the once and future outlaw. Speaking of the trio, Butch, Sundance, and Etta would reappear in December 1905 in the town of Villa Mercedes, Argentina, a bustling commercial center where cattle were shipped daily by rail to cities like Buenos Aires that lay some 400 miles away. Most notably for our trio of outlaws at least, Villa Mercedes was the home of a Banco de la Nación, which on the 19th of December just happened to have its vault stuffed to the brim as a result of the town's monthly cattle sale, making it quite the tempting target for experienced bank robbers, especially those who were in need of a payday after they had been run off their ranch as a result of a crime they hadn't actually committed. On the afternoon of the 19th, then, 4 individuals on horseback would approach the bank. As one waited outside with said horses, the other 3 entered the bank with guns and knives already drawn, punctuating their immediate demand for all the money in the safe. Now, apparently the bank manager was a bit slow to respond or otherwise made some kind of protest as they were struck in the head by the butt of a revolver by one of the thieves. Regardless, the robbers quickly set about retrieving the money from the safe and stuffing it into the sacks they had brought with them, working quickly and efficiently as they did so, as they were in and out under the span of 4 minutes, coming away as they did so with an estimated 14,000 pesos, which comes to somewhere north of $252,000 today. As the quartet of outlaws were riding away, though, the bank's treasurer grabbed a gun and began firing after them, as did several others who were on the street, but they apparently all missed. The police, meanwhile, upon being alerted, formed a posse and set off in pursuit of the fleeing bank robbers, catching up with them outside the town of Buena Esperanza, where the outlaws for some reason stopped and exchanged fire with the posse pursuing them, a choice which, according to some accounts, resulted in one of the outlaws being struck by a bullet, causing the others to pause and take care of them. Soon, however, the outlaws were off again, and in typical Butch Cassidy fashion, they took advantage of a series of relay points with fresh supplies and horses as they fled toward the Chilean border. It was then, thanks to the fresh horses and a bit of torrential rainfall, that the bandits finally managed to elude the pursuers, who were ultimately forced to turn back empty-handed. Now, the local authorities in Villa Mercedes didn't seem to have a clue as to who was responsible for this brazen robbery. The Pinkertons, on the other hand, were ready to provide an answer, as they informed the papers in Buenos Aires that those responsible were Butch Cassidy, the Sundance Kid, and their friend and old partner in crime, Harvey Logan. As for the identity of the fourth bandit, the private detectives asserted they were none other than Sundance's wife, Etta Place, as they called her a, quote, interesting woman, very masculine, who wears male clothing with total correctness, and who is dedicated more to the occupations of men than those of women. Indeed, they would note she was a, quote, fine rider, handles with precision all classes of firearms, and has an admirable male temperament, which I'm sure they likely meant as an insult and as a way of calling her unnatural. Regardless, with this information in hand, the authorities in Villa Mercedes began interviewing people who had interacted with the suspected bank robbers, like, for example, individuals who claimed that the robbers had, before the robbery, stopped off in a bar a couple blocks away. Upon being shown pictures of the suspects, these individuals would identify Butch, Sundance, and Etta as the people they saw, yet Harvey was apparently not one of the four. The same was true when the foreman of a ranch outside of town where the Americans had stayed before the robbery was shown their photographs, as he too identified Butch, Sundance, and Etta, but not Logan. Yet, even though the authorities of Villa Mercedes had seemingly identified those responsible for the daring robbery, that did not change the fact that by this point they had for all intents and purposes gotten away. Meanwhile, it's at this point, after being identified as one of the likely bank robbers of Villa Mercedes, Etta Place just kind of disappears from the historical record. Just like no one really knows who she was or where she came from before her time with Sundance, no one knows where she went afterwards or why. It's possible the two could have split. After all, it's one thing to get involved with a known criminal when he and his friend are planning to escape that life and settle down someplace quiet and peaceful. It's a whole other thing, though, when the quiet life is snatched away from you and the chances of you two ever reclaiming that life looks, if not impossible, then at the very least a long ways off. In such a case, Etta may have taken her cut of the robbery and looked to disappear back into society, as she was nowhere near as wanted as Butch and Sundance were. Plus, no one really seemed to know who she was. There is also an account of Butch claiming that Etta came down with a bout of appendicitis, which saw Sundance escorting her back to the States for surgery, where he subsequently left her. That being said, there is also speculation that perhaps the bandit that had reportedly been shot while fleeing the Villa Mercedes robbery was Etta, with the suggestion being the wound might have been fatal, and as such she didn't disappear from the historical record, but instead died and was quietly buried. Again, though, this is nothing but speculation. Any one of these might be true, or even none of them. Regardless, the next time Sundance would appear, he was working for a railroad construction contractor using the name Enrique Brown. Brown/Sundance's job for this outfit was to break mules and drive them from northern Argentina to a camp near La Paz, Bolivia. Meanwhile, Butch Cassidy would also appear under the name Santiago Maxwell, as he worked a job buying livestock to haul supplies and payroll to the Concordia tin mines in Tres Cruces, Bolivia, 70 miles southeast of La Paz. Tin mining was especially important for Bolivia at the time, as it was a major wealth generator. You see, following the Spanish conquest of the region, Bolivia in particular had proven to be quite profitable due to the discovery of silver in the region. The land, however, would by the end of the 18th century be effectively stripped of all of its silver, which, as you might guess, was not great news for the Bolivian economy. They were somewhat saved then by the fact that their land was still rich in another mineral that could be mined, tin, a mineral that by the dawn of the 1900s would become even more valuable thanks to the invention of tin cans and automobiles. As is all too often the case though, only a select group of individuals would profit off the wealth they were generating by mining tin and selling it off to the companies involved in the manufacturing of the aforementioned tin cans and automobiles. Meanwhile, the actual people doing the physical labor of mining the tin, people who were oftentimes part of the indigenous population, did not benefit at all. Instead, they found themselves laboring in exceptionally dangerous mines for low pay and were not even provided with access to education or granted any kind of voice in the government of the country. As for Cassidy, he would impress his boss at the Concordia tin mines when shortly after being hired he was given $200 with which to buy a string of mules. Cassidy then returned not only with a group of unusually high-quality animals, but also with $50 in change. Indeed, Cassidy was so good at his job he was soon promoted to escorting the mine's payroll, which often exceeded $100,000. Suffice it to say then, Cassidy was considered to be a trusted employee, and thus when he put in a good word for Sundance, his old friend was also hired by the mine. That being said, Sundance during this period was described as being standoffish and even sullen. In fact, he was reportedly drinking heavily, information which again invites speculation as to what happened with Edna following their last heist, without providing any kind of clarity. Regardless, the two outlaws would become fairly close with fellow American Percy Sieber, who was serving as a mining engineer and eventual manager of the mine. From all appearances then, Butch and Sundance were simply two loyal and dependable employees. Indeed, Sieber would be particularly impressed when Cassidy, upon learning about a plot to steal the mine's payroll, which he was in charge of guarding, confronted the two men allegedly involved. When he did, the two actually confessed to planning the heist, as they claimed to be in desperate need of money, and that was the only way they saw to get it. Butch responded to the situation then by giving each man $50, but in doing so, he told them they had to leave the mining camp, which they apparently did. Cassidy then, seemingly while empathetic with their plight, still took his job seriously and would not allow them to rob the payroll. That being said, this doesn't necessarily mean the two outlaws were out of the game by any stretch. Indeed, the pair of Butch and Sundance would depart the mining camp from time to time on personal business. What the nature of this business was, we don't know, although it was noted that more often than not, when they came back they did so with some extra money in their pockets. Now, whether this extra cash was from gambling or from some minor heist, we don't know. What is known is that in November 1907, when the pair took a leave of absence from the Concordia mine, they did so to travel to Santa Cruz, where they seemed to be looking to buy some land, suggesting they were thinking about making another attempt to live quietly as ranchers. Indeed, they appeared to be quite taken with the land, as even though the water situation wasn't ideal, the grass there was good and indeed everything seemed to grow well in the region. Plus, the land was cheap, and while it was a bit isolated, it would soon be connected by a small rail line that would make it easier to ship livestock to the market. For whatever reason, though, the two would not opt to try and settle down again. Perhaps they just did not trust that their past would not catch up with them again, thereby forcing them to leave everything behind, just like they had in Cholula. Which doesn't seem to be an irrational fear, considering that round about this time, the real identities of Santiago Maxwell and Enrique Brown were somehow revealed to their co-workers at the Concordia mine. Indeed, Butch and Sundance wouldn't even attempt to deny who they were, although they would make sure to assure their friend and boss Siebert that they would never rob someone who they were working for, an assurance that was apparently good enough for the mining engineer. Now, while it does not seem like anyone at the mine was overly worried about the pair of outlaws living and working in their midst, the same could not be said of those in the surrounding community, as when word got out that the mine was apparently harboring a pair of infamous outlaws, the reaction was quite different. Word that apparently leaked thanks to none other than the Sundance Kid himself, who supposedly got drunk in a nearby town one night and, in his inebriated state, started bragging about all the crimes he and Butch had committed. Stories that the locals apparently didn't find all that entertaining. So, with the local community up in arms, Butch and Sundance soon settled their accounts, got their final pay, and departed from the mining camp. All of which seemingly fit in with the discussion Cassidy reportedly had with Siebert during their time working together, As according to Seabird, he had asked Cassidy why he and Sundance had returned to their outlaw ways after their attempts to go straight. To which Butch replied they had no choice. Once you're an outlaw, you're always an outlaw. There's always an informer around to bring the law on you. After you've started, you have to keep going. The only answer then was to keep moving, which the pair did as they eventually made their way into Peru, where they are suspected of attempting to rob a stagecoach that they believe was carrying a significant amount of money to the Santo Domingo mine. Yet what the would-be robbers didn't realize was the mine's officials had sent two coaches, one as a diversion and one that was actually carrying the money, with the hope being that bandits would attempt to rob the wrong one, and being discouraged by their lack of success allow the other to pass unmolested. A plan that apparently worked to perfection, as upon searching the vehicle, the two outlaws found nothing, and so they sent the coach and its passengers, who they had not even attempted to rob, on their way. The pair then presumably departed as well, never thinking that a second coach might be coming that would actually be carrying the money. May and August 1908, on the other hand, would see a pair of more successful robberies that were allegedly conducted by two English-speaking men who were assumed to have been Butch and Sundance. However, reports actually placed the two as being elsewhere at the times when these robberies were taking place, suggesting that it might not have been them, but the crimes had simply been attributed to them, as they were the most well-known American bandits in the region. Indeed, instead of committing robberies, Butch and Sundance were supposedly working at a gold ore dredging operation near the town of Tupiza for one A.G. Francis, a British engineer employed by the San Juan del Oro Dredging Company. Yet they seemed to have other motivations for taking this job, or at the very least they kept their eyes open for other opportunities. As Cassidy reportedly visited the town to check out its bank, look for any vulnerabilities, and scout the surrounding area for potential escape routes, including places where they could stash their typical relay of horses. Cassidy's initial impressions of the town and the bank looked promising. However, their plans would be dashed when a Bolivian cavalry unit decided to set up their headquarters in the hotel right next to the bank. All of a sudden, it didn't seem like such a good idea to rob that particular bank anymore, what with a contingent of soldiers who were also trained horsemen right next door and all. There was a bit of good news for the outlaws, however, as it turns out that all of Cassidy's scouting wasn't in vain. You see, while the idea of robbing the bank was bust, he had learned that the Arameo Frankencia silver mine, whose office was also located in town, regularly sent out a payroll of some 80,000 bolivianos, which equates to somewhere in the neighborhood of well over $500,000 in today's money, to one of their mines that was located a 3 days ride outside of town, which, suffice it to say, was too tempting of a price for the two American outlaws to pass up. And so the pair set to work trying to figure out more about this cash shipment and when it was being sent out. To that end, they checked into a room at the hotel terminus, just so they could keep an eye on the mining company's office, watching for signs that they were about to ship out a huge payroll. Signs like when on the 3rd of November, Carlos Pero, an official for the mining company, his son Mariano, and a servant all departed from the Arameo office with a pair of pack mules that were carrying a number of saddlebags in tow. This had to be it, so the two outlaws set off as well, making sure to follow at a safe distance behind the Mariano's small train of pack mules so as to not arouse suspicions. Doing so as they were confident that since the journey was going to take 3 days, they would have ample time to ride ahead to find some place to ambush them. Indeed, when Carlos and his companions stopped on the first night at the village of Catania, Butch and Sundance continued on the road as they began to search for the perfect spot to spring their trap, apparently finding just a place at the base of Huacahuanasca, which translates to Dead Cow Hill. It was here then on the 4th of November 1908 that two men, presumably Butch and Sundance, waited behind a large boulder with bandanas covering their faces and their narrow, soft-brimmed hats pulled down low so only their eyes were visible. They lay in wait until about 9:30 in the morning when the small pack train from the Arameo Mining Company rounded the bend in the road as they circled around the base of the hill. As the trio of unsuspecting mine representatives drew near, the two concealed men stepped out brandishing their weapons, forcing the men and their pack mules to a halt. As the taller of the two bandits, presumably Sundance, kept his weapons trained on the trio, his companion, presumably Butch, did all the talking. Later, the three would describe the men who robbed them as quite polite, as they were ordered off their mules in a, quote, very pleasant manner. Even as they were ordered to open up the saddlebags on the mules so the bandits could steal the mine's payroll, the outlaws kept a very calm, pleasant, and polite manner. a move that might have been slightly difficult to maintain when what they found in said saddlebags was a far cry from the 80,000 bolivianos, or well over $500,000 they were expecting, as the mules were only carrying 15,000 bolivianos, or roughly $150,000 in today's money, which, while not nothing, was again nowhere near the massive payday they were anticipating. Carlos would explain to the confused bandits that this wasn't actually the payroll shipment they were looking for. Yes, they were planning on moving 80,000 bolivianos, but that particular shipment wasn't scheduled to depart until the following week. The outlaws had misinterpreted the signs and robbed the wrong caravan, a situation that had to frustrate the two outlaws, and yet they still made no move to steal any of the personal belongings of the three men. They had just been after the company's funds, and so that's all they took, other than one of the three mules to help carry what they had managed to steal. With this business done, the larger of the two masked men said something along the lines of, quote, "Now you gentlemen should head down that trail and not look back. I would hate to have to clean my gun today." With this warning given, the small caravan continued on as before. Yet at the first chance they got, the three men put out word about what had happened to them, and soon news of the robbery began spreading far and wide by telegraph. Now, in many ways, this had been an almost perfect crime. They had struck in an isolated location, thus giving themselves plenty of time to get away before anyone could be set on their trail, and there was no way to physically identify either man as covered up as they were. The individuals responsible for this robbery then should have been able to quietly disappear and remain completely anonymous and free of pursuit from the authorities. Or that would have been the case except for one thing, that even if it didn't reveal their exact identities, it very much narrowed down who they could be, thus making them much easier to find. You see, by simply speaking and addressing the mining representatives they were robbing, the bandits had revealed the fact that they had a North American accent. Simply put, as soon as the men spoke, they were very much in trouble. Now they could have solved this little problem by killing the three men they had robbed, as again they had committed this crime in an isolated location, meaning that even if they did nothing to hide what they had done, it would still have been some time before anyone found the bodies. Most importantly though, such an act would have ensured that there were no witnesses who could identify them by their accents that very much stood out in the region. However, that was not the way Butch and Sundance did business. As a result, by the afternoon of that same day, nearly every town in the area had not only been alerted about the robbery, but they had been told to be on the lookout for two North Americans. Soon, military patrols and even bands of armed miners were out and about looking for these North American bandits, as, after all, the miners had a vested interest in the crime, what with it being their payroll that had been stolen. Things were not looking good for the robbers, because basically as soon as the authorities were alerted of the robbery and the proverbial hounds were let loose, it was pretty much only a matter of time before the two men responsible were found. Sure, the two bandits could run, but they could not exactly hide. They weren't in the American West anymore, they were in Bolivia, so it wasn't like they could blend in with the general populace. Regardless of whether or not they fully realized how much trouble they were in, Butch and Sundance moved stealthily and at night as they did their best to avoid attention, eventually arriving around midnight in the new camp of their acquaintance A.G. Francis, the British engineer employed by the San Juan del Oro Dredging Company, whose previous camp they had stayed in and even potentially worked in while they were initially scouting the bank into Pisa. Just like before, the two men were welcomed in and allowed to stay the night. As they did so, the pair surprisingly made no attempt to hide who they were or what they had done, as while Cassidy would go to bed immediately, having fallen ill along the way, Sundance would stay up and during a shared meal with Francis, reportedly told the engineer all about their latest heist, an account that didn't seem to bother Francis all that much, as he reportedly found the two outlaws quite charming, calling them, quote, "very pleasant and amusing companions." The following morning, as they sat down for breakfast, a mutual acquaintance of the outlaws and the engineer suddenly arrived in camp with a warning. A military patrol was heading their way. Francis was surprised then when his companions did not appear to be alarmed at all by this news, and instead calmly finished their meal. He would only be further surprised, though, when the pair, after packing up their horses, suggested/insisted that Francis personally act as their guide as they headed north fleeing pursuit. A choice and direction which came as a surprise to the engineer, who had expected the two men to flee south toward Argentina. Now, it has to be said, the British engineer didn't exactly like this plan. As it turns out, the whole prospect of fleeing armed patrols in the company of the pair of bandits said armed patrols were hunting was not all that appealing. However, Francis felt like he didn't really have a choice in the matter, so he, quote, decided to put as good a face on the matter as possible. The three then traveled throughout the day with the British engineer leading the way, finally reaching the Indian pueblo of Estaca where Francis was known and thus was able to get them a place to stay for the night. Come the morning then, A.G. Francis would be the recipient of one final surprise, as Butch and Sundance simply thanked him for his aid and informed him that he was now free to return back to his encampment, asking only that if he were to be questioned by any soldiers that he'd tell them they were heading south toward Argentina. Thus, hoping to mislead those hunting them, the two bandits then rode in the opposite direction, generally heading north throughout the day, finally arriving around sundown at a small mining village known as San Vicente, which, located as it was some 14,500 feet above sea level in the Cordillera Occidental Mountains, was quite cold and windy at night. So, not wanting to try and sleep out in the open without shelter in such conditions, the pair asked if there was someplace in town where they could lodge for the night. While there was no inn, the town's mayor or rough equivalent, Cleto Bayard, said they could stay in the spare room of one Bonifacio Casasola. The pair then thanked them for their hospitality and requested a simple meal of sardines and beer, which they provided Casasola with more than enough money to cover. At which point the two outsiders unsaddled and took care of their mounts before retiring to their rooms to relax, apparently feeling fairly safe and comfortable when they did so, as they left both their saddles and their rifles outside on the patio rather than taking them into their rooms. They really shouldn't have been so comfortable though, as even this relatively remote community had by now heard of the robbery. In fact, a military patrol had just passed through, warning Bayard, the town's mayor, to be on the lookout for a pair of Yankees with a mule that bore the Arameo brand. Yet, even with this knowledge and his suspicions about the pair of North Americans arriving in his remote community, Bayard played it cool when dealing with the two men. In fact, he even gave the pair directions to a road that led south to Argentina when they asked about it, with the duo likely doing so just to plant more breadcrumbs in the wrong direction for the authorities to follow. The pair then settled in for the night, seemingly confident they hadn't been identified, or at the very least feeling comfortable that if they had, they would be long gone before anyone hunting them would arrive. What they didn't know, though, was as they were settling in for the night, the mayor was leaving town looking for the military patrol that had passed through earlier. A patrol that had apparently consisted of 4 men, Captain Concha, a police inspector named Timoteo Reyes, and a pair of soldiers. Now, inexplicably, only 3 of the men were present in their camp when Bayard arrived, informing them that their quarry, the robbers, had arrived and were currently staying in his town. The 3 men leapt into motion at this, and with Captain Concha otherwise occupied, possibly asleep or drunk or who knows what, one of these soldiers, Victor Torres, took the lead as they headed back to San Vicente, where they would be joined by members of the town council who had armed themselves in preparation for this moment. As this group marched off to the Casasola residence, Torres again took the lead. Yet as he stepped onto the patio moving stealthily toward the room where the 2 North Americans were staying, Butch Cassidy reportedly saw the figure approaching in the darkness with his gun clearly drawn. Cassidy then apparently struck first, firing a shot from his revolver striking the stalking figure in the neck. A mortal wound, but not one that would kill Torres immediately. Instead, he actually managed to return fire as he retreated. The remaining members of his patrol and the various townsfolk who had also come to help did the same, as they fired upon the room containing the 2 outlaws even as they retreated to a safer distance. As the outlaws responded with the occasional gunshot of their own, Mayor Bayard fled the scene, only to run into the missing Captain Concha, who, upon being brought up to speed about the situation, ordered the village leader to round up some more armed members of his community to come and join the fight. Soon the hacienda was entirely surrounded, at which point it became quite obvious to Butch and Sundance that they were clearly outnumbered and outgunned, especially since they had left their rifles outside where they could not reach them without being shot. The military/town forces then remained in place surrounding the hacienda throughout the night. Then, after hours of apparent inactivity and silence from inside, the next morning they approached the room to find the 2 men inside were already dead, with the larger of the 2 men, presumably Sundance, found behind the door quote-unquote hugging a large ceramic jar. He had a bullet wound to his arm and a fatal one to his forehead. Meanwhile, the smaller bandit, presumably Butch Cassidy, was found laying sprawled out on the floor with a bullet wound to his arm and another to his temple. It looked then like the two men, seeing no way out and wanting no part of a Bolivian jail, had killed themselves. Or to be more precise, it appeared that the 42-year-old Cassidy had killed the 41-year-old Sundance before turning the gun onto himself. A situation that was markedly different than the one depicted in the movie, which I might have had more to say about, but I kinda disassociated during the escape from the Bolivian bank scene due to the music playing behind it, and I never really found my focus again. Regardless, the two men were buried in unmarked graves. Now, it has to be said that while the authorities would identify the two men killed in San Vicente as the same two men who had robbed the Arameo payroll, as said payroll was found among their possessions, the pair would never officially be identified as the infamous American bandits Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. A situation that could simply be chalked up to the fact that the Bolivians had no real reason to know who Butch and Sundance were. All they knew were a pair of Americans had robbed a mine's payroll and they had killed them. That's all that really mattered as far as they were concerned. This lack of confirmation concerning the pair's identities, however, has allowed myth and legend to suggest that the pair did not actually die in the shootout, but had instead lived well past this time. Now, the origins of this can at least be partially traced back to their relatives in the States, as in the very beginning they were not convinced when they started hearing word that the two men had been killed in Bolivia. This largely came down to the fact that they had heard tell of the two men's deaths before, and such stories had always proven false. Some even believed that the pair might have started the rumors themselves so as to get the heat off of them, potentially hoping that once they were presumed dead, they could simply slip back into America and settle down now that there was no one looking for them. The problem with this belief, though, is that unlike the robbery in Rio Gallegos, where the physical descriptions didn't really seem to match up, that doesn't seem to be the case here. Plus, the method of conducting the robbery, the general politeness, and the refusal to kill the mine company representatives, even though it would have prevented their identification, matched the general behavior of the two. Then there's also the fact that the correspondence between the outlaws and the select friends and family who they had remained in contact with ceased around this time as well. New letters stopped coming, and the missives sent to their various aliases were returned unclaimed. Plus, most tellingly, is the account of A.G. Francis, who had spent time with the pair of bandits before their eventual demise, and who was convinced the two men he had met were Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Now, granted, he had known them by other names, presumably aliases, but upon being given the description of the infamous Butch and Sundance, Francis was convinced they were the same men he had interacted and spent time with. Despite their apparent deaths, though, the legend of Butch and Sundance would live on to some extent. For example, a story from 1910 would claim that Butch, Sundance, and Harvey Logan had formed a formidable gang in Argentina, a gang so powerful that the Argentinian government was actually paying them so they would not wreak havoc throughout the country. Meanwhile, there has been no definitive proof that the two bandits had in fact been Butch and Sundance. For example, attempts to DNA test the remains came up empty, but that's because it's believed the remains they tested did not actually belong to one of the robbers, as they would subsequently locate earlier photographs of the grave they had dug up, and in doing so discovered that it had previously borne a plaque that had since gone missing, which stated the grave contained the remains of a German miner who had blown himself up. An explosion that explained the metal fragments present in the skeleton that had been assumed to be from bullets. This general lack of confirmation then has left the door open to stories that the pair had not died. Some individuals over the years have even claimed to have either been one of the two outlaws or one of their descendants. Now, the most famous example of this was one William T. Phillips of Spokane, Washington, who claimed to have actually been Butch Cassidy. According to Phillips, he had not died in Bolivia, but had escaped and returned to the U.S. Phillips even wrote a manuscript titled The Bandit Invincible, The Story of Butch Cassidy, a recounting of Cassidy's life written in the third person, which notably portrayed the outlaw as a Robin Hood-type figure, a tome that some believe was actually a thinly veiled autobiography written by the man himself. Among those who became convinced of this scenario was author Larry Pointer, who was of the belief that the manuscript contained the kind of details that only Cassidy himself would know. Pointer then became even more convinced when he examined and compared photographs of Cassidy and Phillips, which ultimately led to Pointer writing a book titled In Search of Butch Cassidy. There are, however, numerous problems with this theory. To begin with, there are documents of Phillips' birth that show he was born in Michigan and not Utah. He also, in The Bandit Invincible, wrote about robbing trains that hadn't even been invented at the time. He also, in the tome, placed Butch and Sundance's Argentina ranch in the wrong part of the country. Then there was the fact that during the time that Cassidy was in Bolivia, Phillips was known to be residing in the States. Phillips even managed to get details wrong about Cassidy's life after his death, as he would claim that after escaping Bolivia, he first went to France where he got plastic surgery, following which he got married. However, Phillips' actual marriage certificate predates the shootout by 5 to 6 months. Then, most damaging to Phillips' case is recent computer analysis of the photos of the elderly Phillips and the young Butch Cassidy. Photos that to the naked eye bore some resemblance, but when examined and measured by computers, showed that there was no way they could be the same individual. Which brings us to Butch's sister Lula, who had apparently never met her brother as she had been a baby when he left home. However, she would claim that he returned and she met him in 1925, nearly 2 decades after his death in Bolivia. Now, it might be tempting to dismiss her claims out of hand, seeing as how, as previously stated, she had never actually met her brother in person. However, according to her account, she wasn't the only member of the family to meet Butch in 1925. For example, according to Lula's retelling of events, her brother Mark was the first member of the family approached by quote-unquote Butch, with Mark initially mistaking the other man for their cousin Fred, indicating that there was a significant degree of family resemblance, and indeed he was said to have the characteristic grin of the family. Additionally, their 81-year-old father was also brought over to meet quote-unquote Butch, and he too was convinced that this was his long-lost son. As to where he had been since his supposed death, quote-unquote Butch claimed to have traveled Europe and visited Alaska before spending some time in Mexico, where he also happened to run into both Etta and Sundance. Notably though, word was among the family, quote-unquote Butch was living quietly under the name of William Phillips, which suggests to me that this wasn't Butch but Phillips who visited Cassidy's family pretending to be him, possibly in an effort to get some additional information for the book he was writing. In doing so, he would have taken advantage of the fact that at best they had not seen their missing kin in 40 years. That being said, there were others who had known Cassidy during his time as an outlaw who would claim that he had visited them in the years after his demise that aren't as easily explained. Now, Butch wasn't the only one who supposedly survived Bolivia, as a man named Hiram Beebe would claim to have also survived that shootout. Hiram was a legit criminal in his own right, having served 10 years in San Quentin for grand larceny, and having also shot and killed an off-duty town marshal after an altercation in a saloon in Provo. What makes him notable for us, though, is the fact that he claimed to have been the Sundance Kid. The main problem with Beebe's claim, though, is that while Sundance was known to be handsome and somewhere between 5'9" and 6 feet tall, Beebe was described as anything but handsome and stood at most 5'2" and 3/4 inches tall. Yet, regardless of whether or not they died in Bolivia, although it does seem likely that they did, the legend of Butch and Sundance would leave a lasting legacy. Indeed, even before their deaths, they would have an impact when in 1903, the activities of the Wild Bunch inspired what's considered to be the first modern film, The Great Train Robbery. That being said, it would be some time before the names Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid were household names. You see, few outside of those directly connected with the group or tasked with hunting them down truly knew their names. As for the most part, they were not often featured prominently in the coverage of the robberies. Many a paper, in fact, would focus on some other members of the gang. It then wouldn't be until another economic depression gripped the nation in the 1930s that the name Butch Cassidy would be revived and given a more mythical status. This happened thanks to one Arthur Chapman, who wrote an article about Cassidy for Elks magazine, in which he described Cassidy as the, quote, coolest, cleverest, and most dangerous outlaw of the age. This legend would then be revived decades later during the tumultuous 1960s. Given what we know about the forces that lead to the creation of such legends, it's not terribly surprising then that the film loosely about their lives starring Robert Redford and Paul Newman would hit such a chord with audiences that were living through the Vietnam War, the anti-war protests it spawned, the ongoing civil rights issues, the numerous urban uprisings, and multiple assassinations. Just as times of extreme unrest led to the initial creation of these legendary outlaw tales, it seems that such times also lead to the retelling of such tales, likely for the same reasons. And that is the end of the story of Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Thank you for listening. Thank you for listening to Distorted History. If you would like to help out, please rate and review the podcast and tell your friends if you think they'll be interested. If you would like ad-free and early episodes, I set up such a feed over at patreon.com/distortedhistory. By paying $10 a month, you will gain access to the special ad-free feed available on Spotify or likely through your podcast app as long as it uses an RSS feed. I will continue to post sources on Ko-fi and Twitter though, as it's just a convenient place to go to access that information. Regardless, once again, thank you for listening, and until next time.